Hello, and thank you for joining us for this session of Confectionery Live. I'm joined by Anna Pierce from Tate Lyle. Can you please introduce yourself, Anna, and give an overview of what you do at Tate Lyle?
Sure. I'm Anna Pierce. I'm Tate Lyle's Director of Sustainability, and I work to develop our sustainability program that matches our company's ambitions, but also enables us to better partner with our customers to help them achieve their sustainability goals and their ambitions.
Perfect. And I'll get right into it, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
What measures do Tate and Lyle have in place to ensure the sustainable sourcing of their raw materials and ingredients?
Um, I think it's always a tricky one because supply chains are like a thread that you start pulling and they just get longer and more complicated depending on the ingredient. I think all of the food and beverage companies have a very similar experience there. For us, it starts with our supplier audit program. So looking at our tier one suppliers, looking at countries based on risk where they're located, and using SEDEX audits as well as at times in-person audits to verify on the ground what we're seeing through SEDEX and questionnaires that we send our suppliers. We also have, from a strict sustainability perspective, it's part of our terms and conditions of doing business. So there's an expectation for our suppliers that they will work with us and share data, that their data, carbon footprint, as well as us sharing data that they may need from a processing of sold product standpoint or operation standpoint to help with their own reporting, and their willingness to participate in those audits. So I think it's something that progresses over time. So you don't immediately see this huge snapshot of your supply chain, but as we get more and more into the process and working with the suppliers closer, I think it enables you to ask those types of questions, like what are the emissions of this exact product? Like, so really talk about these questions that we have. A cold email doesn't do that. So I do see it as a way also of just relationship building.
And can you just briefly explain what you mean by tier one? No, sorry, I'm unfamiliar.
So tier one would be our direct suppliers. So they're supplying us directly versus tier two is someone lower in the supply chain. So they're supplying a supplier who then later supplies us. So right now we have really good visibility to those suppliers that are directly supplying us, which we call our tier one suppliers.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And can I just ask, how is Tate Lyle incorporating sustainability metrics into its supply selection and evaluation processes?
That's a longer process. So we're looking at it from a supplier qualification standpoint first in how we're doing business with suppliers. What are suppliers of choice and what does that look like? I think in the longer term, we'll start to build in some supplier specific qualification metrics. I think in that space, in some instances, it's still early days. So when you talk to even our customers, there's a portion of our customers, a fairly good portion, that don't track greenhouse gas emissions. So then when you start to look deeper into the supply chain, closer to farms and agricultural ingredients, some of those suppliers and processors of those raw materials, they're just not there from a maturity standpoint. So we're trying to meet our suppliers where they are, collect data, help them understand the process and the importance of sustainability and measuring their own impact and working to decrease it. And that's something that takes time. So we haven't jumped to the place yet of having specific hard criteria around what supplier we will or will not partner with.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. And can I just ask, how does Tate Lyle track measure the energy efficiency of its operations across different sites? I know you were obviously talking about the sustainability metrics, but in terms of energy, how does that work?
Sure. We use a online tool called Benchmark GenSuite. It's an ESG data collection tool. So our facilities that meet our reporting criteria are reporting in the metrics around their energy use, their fuel consumption, so that we're able to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions from our own operations. But then we also have a sustainable engineering team that's really working with each of the sites to understand their energy intensity, the hot spots in intensity, so where we have opportunities to decarbonize, and then starting to flow down project roadmaps, and really look at the feasibility of some of the ideas that we have generated through the sites. They also come from decarbonization assessments that we conducted in our 4 largest facilities. So we have a good sense of where we have opportunities. It's just a matter of how feasible that is. So, for instance, if we electrified an entire facility, certainly would decarbonize the site, but you have to have the infrastructure available to fully electrify the facility. And in some cases, for the amount of electricity that our sites use, it's not feasible yet. It's something that we certainly have planned between now and 2050, but it's something that we monitor.
And you mentioned 2050, the future, and the roadmaps that you're kind of coming up with at the moment. And what goals does Tate Lyle have for improving energy efficiency over the next, sort of 5 to 10 years?
Sure. We have just May of this year approved 1.5 science-based targets. So previously we had well below 2 targets. They were set for 2030. We really looked at, again, those decarbonization assessments and opportunities that we had to decarbonize, and we set more ambitious targets. So for scope 1 and 2, our energy and industrial operations emissions, we have a 38% reduction target by 2028. We have that same 38% reduction target for our scope 3 emissions. And then when we look at our flag emissions, we have a 23% reduction target by 2028. So I do think that the changes in the criteria by SBTi, including flag emissions, were certainly the driver behind us looking at the targets that we had set, because we were accounting for emissions in a different way. And we saw a real opportunity to set more ambitious targets. I think from a timing perspective, the date of the target was also important to us. So when we talk about partnering with customers, if you have the same target year that they have, they can't fully realize the decarbonization that's happening in your supply chain and your operations. So we moved our target up by 2 years so that we will have achieved a greater decarbonization than we had initially thought at the well below 2 level, 2 years faster, to enable all of that emissions accounting that goes on and auditing behind the scenes for our customers to be able to report out on their own science-based targets or greenhouse gas reduction targets. So I think for us, it was really taking a hard look at what did we commit to and could we do more? And that's the way that we operate very much in the sustainability space is what are we doing, but could we do a little bit more? Could we partner better? And that was a great example of the team really working through it.
You said 2028, then, and I realized that is only 4 years away.
It is. It is. It's yeah. I think when we set those targets, it's not something that we say, oh, that sounds really nice. Let's set that target, and everyone just nods their head, and we have no idea how to get there. When we talk about the governance process, and it goes through our executive committee, and then it goes to our board, we have line of sight to projects. All of the trajectories are mapped out to achieve those targets. Everyone has a little bit different strategy on how to set and achieve targets. I think for us, it has to be a stretch, or it's not a target if you aren't stretching yourselves and really pushing to do more. But we do have line of sight to achieve the targets by 2028. Yeah, and it's sooner than we would think.
Yeah, I imagine those are very very kind of detailed meetings that you have to have.
Yeah, we rely a lot on our sustainability engineers and our engineering team. But I think when you start to work through setting targets, and you're talking about supply chains, and you're talking about sustainable agriculture, the more conversations we have with other functional leaders and our executive teams, everyone becomes really well versed in sustainability as it relates to their function, their topic of interest. Our commercial team's very interested in our product carbon footprints and how we're partnering with our customers. And our ICD team is very interested in how this impacts new product design and development. So it enables this really kind of robust and interesting conversation as everyone kind of peels it away and says, well, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for our function? How are we going to work now? And that's really helped change the culture of the company and thinking about sustainability as a true priority, versus kind of that we'll call Anna at the end of the project and see what she says. We're very much engaged, right from the start.
And of course, it requires a lot of collaboration amongst you all, which is very impressive. I just wanted to ask, what role does innovation play in Tate and Lyle's efforts to combat food waste specifically?
I think for us, when we look at our waste streams, because most of the ingredients that we procure and goes into our products, they're all agriculturally based as a food ingredient company. So from an ingredient standpoint, most of what we're manufacturing is going directly to our customers. It's fully consumed in their product that ends up at retailers and ultimately customers. Of course, there's a quality issue that pops up once in a while, and that product didn't meet spec. What are we doing with our waste? And for us, when we started to think about setting a waste target, our target's 100% beneficial use of waste by 2030, meaning that the waste isn't going to landfill. So a lot of our waste is actually land applied by local farmers around our facilities. It adds nutrients. It's healthy for the soil. It does kind of give you that full circularity that we all look for. And it's very local in that community. We also have instances where that isn't possible. And in those cases, we'll send some of the waste to waste to energy. And it's used to generate new energy in the area. I think there's not a tremendous amount of waste because as you're looking at our processing, oftentimes the byproducts are then further used as animal nutrition. So it's a whole different stream and customer base from someone that's eating a bread or a pastry. It's definitely a different consumer group, but it lets us more wholly use the kernel of corn that we're manufacturing. We have stevia lines in place that are using what would be kind of leftover from the process that now can be further processed into a low calorie sweetener that we all certainly have a need for. So I do think that the team is constantly innovating to say, what's the value of the byproduct? What's the value of what's left over? And coming up with new ways, either through our engineering processes or through working with local farmers to really eliminate the need for us to dispose of waste via landfill. So we're up over that 90% mark. Getting to 100 is tough. I think, we get new acquisitions and we meet everyone where they are, and some are really there and some need help connecting to vendors and suppliers and farmers and sorting out what's the best streams for all of their waste in terms of an endpoint. But I think we're lucky in terms of our place in the supply chain that we don't see food waste as being a tremendous issue, particularly for us. It certainly is for our customers. Absolutely.
And you mentioned that 90% there. And how do you sort of measure the impact of the food waste reduction initiatives when there are people on the ground that are sort of reusing products? How do you keep data on that?
For us, we measure the overall waste that our facilities generate. And then for every single type of disposal, we are weighing and measuring the waste that goes out. So if it's beneficially used, it's either given to local sites and local communities. So we're not measuring that it's being used beneficially. If it's sold commercially, it's obviously part of our commercial process. What isn't? For general plant trash, um, things that we can't recycle. The sites are physically weighing it. They put data again back into Benchmark Gen Suite every single month. This is the waste that we generated. This is how every single stream of that waste was disposed of. We track it, we roll it up annually, and then it goes through a third party reasonable assurance audit. So it's all audited, verified information.
A lot of work putting into the supply chain there.
Yeah, I think the sustainability metrics are starting very much to be treated like financials. So there has to be a really robust data management, data integrity, auditing process, audit trail, and verification along the way. Um, I think it's just a mark of frankly good business.
I would tend to agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just ask also, what steps is Tate and Lyle taking to set science-based carbon reduction targets aligned with the global climate goals that obviously we all face the pressure of? Mhm.
We have the 1.5 target. So they just got approved for us in May. Those 2028 targets that I spoke about. And I think we have yet to set a 2050 net zero science based target. We have a net zero commitment by 2050. We have line of sight to about 2/3 of the emissions that will hit close to net zero by 2050. I think as time goes on, we'll see technology and innovation really driving the remainder of those emissions are close to it as we get to 2050. I also think the sustainability space is changing so incredibly quickly in terms of the science-based targets that we set, what the criteria look like. The flag emissions are a great example that it's really hard to say with certainty, this is exactly how I'm going to account for it by 2050. It's a very far way out. So 2028 seems like tomorrow. 2050 seems maybe a little too far out for us in terms of setting a science-based net zero target. Um, I think the process helps add some certainty to the decarbonization that companies plan for. So I do think when you look at companies that have set science-based targets versus companies that have not, it certainly gives our customers and our investors a level of confidence. We've done the homework. We understand the path to get there. We're working on it. We've committed to this publicly. It's not something we're going to miss. And I think it makes people feel like they can rely on the claims and the statements that you're making. And it's not just this wish that somehow magically we'll all get to a science-based 1.5 target.
And yeah, can you just elaborate on some of the more specific areas where you're seeing the greatest potential for carbon reduction at Tate and Lyle?
Sure. I think for us, we have a capital expenditure plan that includes some pretty fantastic opportunities to decarbonize through partnerships. So I think we're working more creatively, certainly. I think the science-based targets have made us think beyond just what can we do within our fence lines for scope 1 and 2, which is exciting, and engaging all of the team as we think about new ways to decarbonize. I think for us, we also have a renewable electricity target, 100% by 2030. It's clearly part of our science-based target by 2028. Obviously, not all of it, as it remains a 2030 target. But there's a lot of opportunity for our smaller facilities to implement and use solar panels. It's a great cost savings opportunity for them in the operations. But then it's also the right thing to do for the planet. So it's a matter of really looking at the strategy and saying, what's the right solution for the site? Do they have enough electricity use that a solar panel's a great fit for them? If it's not, can we work with the utility? Is there a way to change the dynamic of how the site is using electricity? And at our last resort, which I think is everyone's last resort, is then purchasing RECs where needed. It's certainly part of our strategy, but we're really working hard to try to use on-site solar where we can at our smaller sites. So I think there's a lot of opportunity just in renewables in general, and the speed at which the industry is changing and the changes that we've seen in cost over time. A decade ago, solar panels weren't financially feasible for a lot of smaller facilities, and today they are. Um, I think for us, Scope 3 is a huge opportunity. We have a really mature program for sustainable corn in the US. We've been partnering with Truterra, that's the sustainability vertical within Land Lakes. It's one of the United States' largest grower-owned cooperatives. And philosophically, it aligns with ensuring that we're helping the farmers to adopt regenerative agricultural practices, but it financially makes sense for the farmers. And as we think about our purpose, we're building thriving communities. It has to be something that's intrinsically good for the farmers to do, because otherwise, when the financial incentives dry up, the farmers just will go back to practicing the old farming practices they had before because it doesn't make sense. So it's really making sure that it's not just chasing decarbonization, but it's chasing a better life for our suppliers and our communities where we live and work and our supply sheds. And we've done the same with stevia in China, with small shareholder farmers in Eastern China. It's mostly women and family-owned farms. So we really started from the ground up with education on soil health and soil sampling and fertilizer optimization. And we've seen really nice impacts there. And the farmers, for the first time in the survey this year, came back and said, we're interested in this program because we need help to make our stevia plants more resilient to climate change because they've experienced flooding over the years. So there's definitely a shift culturally within our suppliers of saying, there's real value here. How can you help us do this? Versus, years ago where we would say, okay, let's all do this program together. It's going to be great for you. There's a pull aspect to it, which I think is really the mark of a successful program locally for them. And those are two of our biggest carbon drivers in purchased goods and services. So when we look at projects into decarbonization, there's no pet projects, right? There's no ones, this is my favorite product line, we're going to do this. It has to be able to make a significant impact in the emissions of our operations and our supply chain, or it just gets deprioritized until we're looking back at some of those larger scale projects where we really see the opportunity to make an impact.
I suppose it's about setting sort of robust goals for yourselves and being able to stick to them. The education actually sounds really important, like key to the aspect of sustainability. That's really interesting. How do you kind of go about educating people on the ground like that?
For us, for the stevia program, we partnered with Earthwatch Europe and Nanjing Agricultural University. They have obviously a very robust agriculture program. They have a stevia program. So we have local experts that are physically able to go and meet with our farmers through COVID restrictions, through all of it. We started the program in 2021, and the farmers do, when we survey them and talk to them about the program, they see value in having someone local, someone with true expertise on site, looking at their results, helping them understand it. If an area of their field isn't as successful or doesn't have as good of a yield as another area, why is that happening? What am I supposed to be doing differently? And then as part of that program, we also have experimental farms. So when you're talking about family-run farms, they can't change everything overnight. It's literally their livelihood. So we have experimental farms where we try a different fertilizer level, look at a different cover crop, and the community then can watch, how's that working this year? Did that work? Didn't it work? Is it better than what I thought it was going to be? And then when we start talking about next year's program, they have a reference point in their community with their local farmers that they know was that as good as we thought it was, or did that really not work out and not a risk I want to take on my farm? And I think that it's a slower process for adoption, but it's meeting them where they are, and they very much want to see it to believe it before they're willing to say our entire family livelihood, we're going to bet on what Tate Lyle and Earthwatch and Nanjing Agricultural University are telling me to do. They want to see it in action. Um, so I think from that perspective, it's just a difference in the scale and the size of farming. I mean, we're talking about half a hectare in China in someone's backyard or garden. In the States, we're talking about 20,000 acre farms. So there's definitely a difference of scale. And frankly, corn's been farmed for tens of thousands of years. Stevia, 40 to 50. So it's still very much a new space where everyone's kind of learning together. What does an optimum crop look like, and how do we get there? Despite changes in climate and weather patterns.
It seems deeply important to foster that sense of community then and sort of get on the ground. Just to widen out the question, so how do you engage with stakeholders on a larger scale about your carbon reduction efforts? I know that you mentioned being very public about setting goals. How do you engage with people all over the world? Obviously, you're a global company.
Yeah, I think I meet with our customers regularly, so we all have these shared goals. Um, I think when you think about science-based targets and you think about greenhouse gas accounting, our emissions become our customers' scope 3 emissions. Our suppliers' emissions become our scope 3 emissions. So there very much was the shift when we all started to account for scope 3 emissions that you couldn't just work within your fence line anymore. I'm worried about my site in my area and I'm going to stay there. The world opened up and it created conversations that I think at first were tough, right? I'm going to give you my data. What are you going to do with my data? Why do you need my data? But wait a minute, I need your data. And I think over time, the more that we work with customers and suppliers, it just becomes a way of doing business. It's no different than what is the volume that we're going to contract for the year, and what's that data point? Can we work together? And I think that agriculture programs have changed that too. So we co-fund regenerative agriculture programs with our customers. It's very much a system of being in it together. No one company can fund this kind of change alone, no matter what your size. So it certainly is something that I think has brought us together and enables a different conversation with suppliers and customers than volume, price, quality, transportation and logistics. It becomes another discussion point that I think is an important one that makes some of those other discussions, frankly, a lot easier when you understand culturally and philosophically where your companies align. I also meet with our investors regularly. So when we're looking at what our investors are concerned about, what they're trying to measure, new areas or topics that they're trying to measure. Sometimes they'll ask for feedback like, "Hey, can you measure this? What does this look like? What's the timeline?" So I think it's an interesting conversation when you look at the investor space, what's important to them that they're trying to drive forward. And then that check on, well, how are we doing against those criteria? And what and where would new criteria be? Right. So it again becomes this more long-term discussion more than a report out of what you would see in our annual report. I think there's a little bit more insight that they're asking questions around what's the strategy? What are you really doing? How robust is this process? And that's something that's, both of those situations have changed dramatically, even in the last 5 years. I mean, the space is just changing so quickly.
It also seems that through these programs, you've sort of ameliorated your relationship with the suppliers. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I certainly think the relationship with the suppliers has improved. I think there's regulations that drive it, like the EU deforestation regulation, where from a regulatory perspective, you have to have those conversations. And in some instances, I think those regulations, because it's a have to have conversation, make the nice to have conversations. We would actually like more data. We would actually like you to think about setting a target. It becomes a little bit more easy to understand why we're asking for what we're asking. Because before, you kind of sounded a little bit like the squeaky wheel. Tate Lyle wants this, Tate Lyle wants that. Their downstream customer wants something else. They're asking me for more. And then when you start to become part of it and you see your place in that reporting chain, I think it just gives everyone a fuller perspective and picture. I mean, we're a supplier to the top CPGs in the world, and they call me with the same questions that I call my suppliers with and ask them about. So I think it's helpful to understand everyone has someone that wants more transparency, better data quality, a better product, a lower footprint, a healthier product. And ultimately, we all answer to the consumers. So, which we're all consumers too. So, when you play a couple different roles there, and we're in the grocery stores looking at what we're buying, it does, you kind of have some of those full circle moments for sure.
That sounds like it's kind of nice to have those full circle moments when you're in the shop and you're kind of buying your products and you're like, oh, we did this.
Right, right. Or you're buying your customer's product and you're like, I know we talked about that and that looks amazing and it tastes the way I thought it was going to taste. And it's a fun space to work in, for sure.
It's wonderful. Well, less fun. What are the challenges that you are faced in setting and achieving your science-based carbon reduction targets?
I think it would be really great if we could see a final greenhouse gas protocol um, on land use change. We've all been working in draft mode, including SBTI, for 2 years. It would be great to see something final that we can all kind of depend on and rely on and move on from the discussion and the what ifs about. Um, and I think that just the time things like that take, I think underscores the complexity of food systems, that everything sounds easy when you start, or maybe not easy, but certainly not this challenging. And then you really start to peel back the layers and everyone's different perspectives and how they're using data and the way that it's reported. I think it's just complicated. So that certainly is a challenge, is working in the unknown or waiting for the next update to happen and thinking, well, we set a target, but is something going to change to have us shift that target sooner than what we thought, which certainly is what, in part what happened with our 2030 target and flag. So there's a little bit of that. I think and that uncertainty can lead to developing and redeveloping trajectories, pathways, accounting. It changes slightly. Everything has to change to the suppliers, to the customers, for our own accounting. There's a balance between, I think, make work and making change happen. So it's a constant kind of battle to make sure that we're not so focused on accounting that we're not moving forward on the progress that we're all committing to. And that's ultimately what we're all trying to do. So I think there's always a give and take in that. I think the disclosures coming in Europe are pretty fast and furious. And they're all coming up right around the same time. So again, it's just that transparency is good, change is good. At the same time, the speed and pace of change is a lot all at once. If we're all still moving forward on progressing the initiatives that frankly are what makes the tangible difference in the way that we do business and live in the world. So I think it's really just the rate and the pace of change it's tough, for sure.
Yeah, I can see how that would be hard to deal with because the technology is always advancing, especially in sustainability at the moment. You mentioned transparency. It's kind of come up a few times with when you mentioned transparency and reporting, ameliorating your relationships with your suppliers. I was wondering, how do you ensure that transparency and to an extent the accountability in reporting when you're working towards your carbon reduction goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, our data goes through third party reasonable assurance audits. So we have good, strong data integrity and data validation process from our sites and our supply chain. So we're fairly confident in where we sit there. We account for over 98% of our scope 3 emissions. So I feel confident about where we are in that space. I think the importance is understanding the data sets that we need as suppliers to our customers, and that they need from us, and having frank conversations about we haven't developed that product carbon footprint yet, but that's on the list in 2 months. And our customers saying we can't break down that energy because that's confidential information. But is it? Let me go check. So I think it forces us all to say what we held so close a year ago or 5 years ago. Do we need to? Is it okay that we share that information? You need it. We need it. And so I think just being really, really clear about what you are doing, what you're not doing, what's working, what's not working. It just helps build trust along the way. And we try to be really transparent and clear in that way about this is what we have, this is what we're doing, and this is something, just like those supplier specific metrics, something we're working towards, but we don't have today. So I think that's just an important aspect of the whole conversation. Particularly when there's so many stakeholders in the value chain that all rely on each other. Have to be honest about where you're at.
The delicate balance.
Sure.
We talked about the corn in the US earlier, and we talked about stevia in China, in Eastern China. Could you share any examples of how Tate Lyle's carbon reduction initiatives have contributed to sort of a broader industry or global sustainability efforts?
I think when we participate in a good number of trade groups and industry groups. So in the States, we participate in the Corn Refiners Association and life cycle analysis development of specific products that are measuring against sugar and alternative sweeteners. So there certainly is data collection that comes from members of various trade groups and associations that help build a platform to discuss the industry at large versus our Tate Lyle versus our competitor, right? So there's this moment where we're all doing the same thing. We might have a voice when we think about the greenhouse gas protocol that's helpful for us collectively to work together on. We are really active in Starch Europe. We do the same thing with the life cycle analysis. We're looking at legislation changes, how we're accounting for emissions, country specific requirements. And I think that's where that collective voice and thought process has the industry moving in the right direction, but also giving the industry a voice to say, collectively, in the last 10 years, we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions by X%. Despite it being in all of our annual reports, as a group, we're doing pretty good. Or we need to set some targets for ourselves among this group because we're not doing as well as what we thought we were doing. So I think it leads to some interesting discussions and a little bit of looking at working together versus looking at that's my competitor. It changes that dynamic, which I think is something that we have to do if we're really going to decarbonize and decrease our footprints at the rate that we all very much want to.
I mean, thank you very much. It's been really insightful, and I've learned a lot from just the few minutes that we've been talking to each other. So thank you very much for speaking. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a fantastic conversation.